Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week has been alternating between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and an Unpacking Scholarship episode where I talk about some of the latest research or some seminal papers in relation to CS education. This week's particular episode is an Unpacking Scholarship episode, and it is unpacking the report titled The Computer Science Teacher Landscape, Results of a Nationwide Teacher Survey. This paper came out in May of 2021. It was very relevant at the time of this recording and release. And the authors for this particular paper are Sonia Kashi, Alexis Martin, Laura Hinton, Allison Scott, Brian Twerk, and Kalisha Davis. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. This paper was a joint collaboration between CSTA and the Kapor Center. All right, so here's the background from the summary of this particular paper. Quote, "The technology sector remains one of the fastest growing industries across the nation and continues to rapidly permeate all facets of society. The next generation of the computing workforce must be equipped with the skills to examine how current systems exacerbate inequities and to develop new, more equitable innovations. To enable this shift, computer science, CS, instruction needs to develop not only students' computing identities and computational thinking, but also critical thinking and ethical reasoning. Teachers are key to this transformation, yet little is known about the landscape of pre-K-12 CS teachers and how equipped they are to provide equitable CS instruction. In order to examine the backgrounds of CS teachers and the support and resources needed to implement culturally relevant computing pedagogical practices, the Kapor Center and the Computer Science Teachers Association surveyed nearly 3,700 pre-K-12 CS teachers across the nation in the summer of 2020." End quote. So if I were to summarize this report into a single sentence, I'd say that this report provides recommendations for the field based on a summary of findings on teacher demographics, current challenges for CS educators, and the state of cultural relevance in CS education. Now, as with the Unpacking Scholarship episode that I did 2 weeks ago, I basically could highlight this whole thing, so I highly recommend actually going and taking a look at this particular report. It is available for free, and I include a direct link to it in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com. or by simply clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. So the first few pages of this particular report provides an executive summary, so you can read some of the main key findings in there. I'm going to skip over that and actually just dive into the findings itself, but it's a good place to start if you want a very quick overview outside of this particular podcast. All right, so this particular report is centered around 4 questions, and they are, quote, number 1, what are the demographic backgrounds of pre-K-12 CS teachers, and what credentials and experience do they bring to CS classrooms? Number 2, what challenges do pre-K-12 CS teachers face in building equitable classrooms? Number 3, to what extent are effective, culturally relevant CS teaching practices culturally implemented in pre-K-12 CS classrooms, and what are the challenges faced by teachers? And number 4, what are the recommendations to support pre-K-12 CS teachers in building equitable and inclusive classrooms? Unquote. That's from page 5. All right, so the report is centered around each one of these. So the first question, what are the demographic backgrounds of CS teachers? So the 77% of the teachers who responded taught in public schools, but of the respondents, only 27% served pre-K through 5, 38% served grades 6 through 8, and then 56% served grades 9 through 12. So in other words, there are significantly less teachers of computer science in the elementary level than there are in middle school and in high school, which honestly makes sense because most of computer science classes and offerings were in the high school level until fairly recently. In the last decade or so, it started to trickle down into middle school and is now more prominent in elementary school, thanks to organizations like Code.org, or even the organization that I work with, Boot Up Professional Development, which focuses on elementary CS education and PD. Now, looking at the data, it's interesting that the demographics for the teachers, overall, 75% of teachers were white, 19% were classified as Black, Indigenous, Latinx, or Pacific Islander, and then 6% were categorized as other. Now, what's interesting for the 75% of teachers of CS being white, the reason why that's interesting is because the NCES released a report. And so the stats in 2017-2018 showed that across all the teachers, 79% were white. And then in 1999 and year 2000, 84% were white. So it appears that it's slowly shifting over the course of a couple of decades, from 84% in 2000 to 79% in 2018, Now, in this particular paper for CS, it's saying 75%. What's also interesting is the way that they broke it down by grades is you can see that in elementary school, 68% were white, in middle school, 74% were white, and then high school, 79% were white. So the higher the grade level, the more likely your CS teacher is going to be white. Also, if you are in a high-income school, you are 82% likely to have a white teacher of computer science. However, if you are in a low-income school, you're only 56% likely to have a teacher who is white, who is teaching computer science. So here's a quote from page 7. Quote, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islander teachers were represented at higher rates at lower income, more racially diverse in urban schools, yet computer science teachers of color are still underrepresented relative to their proportion of the teaching workforce, end quote. Now, shifting over to their findings on gender, 64% of the teachers who responded were women, which they say is, quote, in alignment with the general pre-K-12 teacher population, end quote. Now, I agree that it is in alignment with the majority of teachers being women. I disagree that it's actually less than the data that I was looking at for NCES, which I include a link to in the show notes. So, for example, in the years 2017 and 18, 76% of teachers were female, but only 64% of teachers of computer science are female. So there's a higher percentage of male population who are CS educators than there are in the teaching field. Now, unfortunately, they don't include gender demographic information outside of the binary, so all it has is male and female. But maybe in future surveys, they can actually include some non-binary individuals like myself. All right, so those were the demographics of the teachers. Now let's actually take a look at some of the courses that they taught. So what's interesting is that only 30% of the respondents had more than 75% of their teaching load dedicated specifically to computer science. So in other words, most of the people who were teaching computer science, that was not their only class that they were teaching. My guess, for example, in high school, like it was in my high school, is it might be like a math educator who's teaching primarily math classes and maybe has 1 or 2 courses in computer science. So something along those lines. So here's a breakdown from one of their charts on page 8, which is describing the different courses that were taught. So 35% of teachers were teaching an intro high school CS course. 27% of teachers were teaching a pre-K-8 CS course as a standalone course. 25% were teaching AP Computer Science Principles. 23% were teaching a specialized CS course or an integrated pre-K-8 CS course. Those were tied. 20% were teaching an AP Computer Science A, and then 16% were teaching an other. Now note that teachers were able to select multiple types, so those percentages obviously don't add up to 100%. So for example, you might be teaching a high school CS course and an AP course or 2, and then not the others. So you can check all 3 of those. All right, so the next main section talking about teachers is what credentials and experiences do teachers bring to CS classrooms? So for example, they looked at the educational background. Here's a quote from page 9. Quote, nearly 30% of teachers graduated with a computer and technical sciences degree, and 6% graduated with a minor in computer science. Notably, high school teachers were more likely than those in elementary and middle schools to have had exposure to post-secondary computer science coursework, with 81% having taken at least 1 computer science course and 38% having majored in the computer and technical sciences. Similarly, teachers who taught at higher income schools, urban schools, and schools with a low proportion of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islander students were more likely to have post-secondary computer science exposure in comparison to their counterparts teaching in lower income schools, rural areas, and more racially diverse schools, end quote. So that finding is interesting. What it might show is that people with more experience are working in the higher income schools, in the less racially diverse schools, and in urban areas, which might lead to the question of why is that? But that's something that will need to be unpacked in follow-up research. This is outside of the scope of this particular survey. All right, so the next subsection on this talks about credentialing. And so it basically shows that, quote, teachers in lower income schools, rural areas, and schools with majority Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islander students were less likely to hold credentials in the computer and technical sciences, end quote. In other words, people who are more likely to have CS-related credentials were likely to teach in higher income schools, in urban areas, and schools with less racial diversity. So thinking back to previous episodes where I've unpacked some scholarship related to hegemonic influences, so the structure of structures and how those things inform inequities within society. Like, think of the Paulo Freire Pedagogy of the Oppressed book chapters that I unpacked, or think of some of the interviews, like with Joyce McCall, Joanna Good, Nikki Washington, etc. In those particular episodes, we talk about how there are systems that are in place that are inequitable and really have an impact on who can have opportunities or access to computer science, which we'll actually talk a little bit more about when it comes to access to devices and internet at home in an upcoming section. But again, tying it back to this particular thing. So what it's basically saying is that kids who are in urban, richer, whiter communities are more likely to have higher access to CS educators with more experience than their peers in rural, poorer, or more racially diverse communities. In addition, in the classroom experience section that is unpacked in the next page on page 11, basically showing that if you're in a low-income school, or a more racially diverse school, or a rural school, it's likely that your CS educator that is working there, or educators, have less experience than in higher income, lower racially diverse, and urban schools. Now, an important finding that's also on page 11 that they talk about is, quote, less than 2/3 of teachers, 61%, reported participating in a professional learning community, and less than 1/3 of teachers, 28%, reported participating in ongoing coaching, end quote. So professional development and community building is something that we can continue to work on. So the nonprofit that I work for, Boot Up, we provide professional development nationwide to educators who want to engage in interest-driven learning through computer science at the elementary level. We also provide free curriculum that use the free platforms Scratch and Scratch Junior. So this makes it so that anybody can use this kind of content. However, not everybody has access to be able to pay to receive professional development. So this is an area that is needed for educators, especially for the educators who don't have experience with computer science or don't have a background in it. So the next section of this paper is addressing the question, what challenges do pre-K-12 CS teachers face in building equitable classrooms? Now, if we look at figure 11 that's on page 12, it is discussing the major challenges to CS education. So I'm just going to kind of highlight each one of these. So 30% of respondents indicated that big challenge was lack of school buy-in. 24% indicated a challenge was a lack of student subject knowledge. 23% indicated a lack of teacher subject knowledge. 22% indicated a lack of hardware or software resources. 21% indicated a lack of student interest or enrollment. And 20% indicated a lack of curricular resources. Okay, so that's the highlight, but they're going to unpack each one of these in the following pages, and I'll just kind of highlight some of the key findings within that. But again, I highly recommend actually checking out this report. Again, it is for free, and it's found in the show notes. So an interesting quote on page 12 under the access to resources section is, quote, almost 2 times more teachers in lower income in comparison to higher income and elementary schools in comparison to middle or high schools were likely to be affected by insufficient hardware or software, end quote. A little bit further down, here's another quote from the same page. Quote, 30% of teachers serving more racially diverse schools describe their students facing barriers brought on by the lack of technology in their homes. As shared by one teacher, none of my students have access to internet or personal computing devices at home. School is the only place they interact with computers in any capacity, end quote. So again, thinking of the hegemonic influences. So people who have higher income are twice as likely to have access to devices and internet at home than households with a lower income. And then when we look at the comparison between elementary and high schools or middle schools, it's basically showing that if you're in a high school or middle school, you're nearly twice as likely to have access to appropriate hardware and software compared to elementary schools. So that's obviously a problem if we want kids to learn computer science and learn how to code. Yes, so you can do unplugged. Yes, there's some really cool stuff that you can do with physical computing without a screen, but it limits your options. In the next subsection on teachers' knowledges of CS content, they basically argue that there's not enough professional development, especially professional development that is low cost, because teachers typically have to pay for that kind of stuff and do it outside of their school time, unless you get some kind of district-wide implementation and commitment from admin to help support this, which is the approach that we use at Boot Up, and I highly recommend it. Now, one of the stats that I previously cited off, they unpack a little bit more on page 14. And this is an interesting one. So, quote, 24% of teachers reported that students' lack of exposure to computer science content was a major challenge to classroom instruction. Middle school and high school teachers were more likely to identify students' lack of content knowledge as a major challenge in comparison to elementary school teachers, end quote. I mean, that makes sense. Like, I don't expect a kindergartner to come in with extensive knowledge on something, and I expect to design and facilitate learning experiences that help them understand the content knowledge. Certainly, they can come in with a lot of content knowledge, but it's not an expectation on my behalf. There's no prerequisites, in other words. Whereas typically in high school, there are sometimes prerequisites for some classes. But in this case, I still kind of look at this and go, but isn't that the point of like teaching? Why are we expecting a certain amount of content knowledge in a subject area that is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively new? But maybe I'm not thinking of a specific scenario where it makes sense that students would have a lot of content knowledge. But again, the fact that this is considered to be a big challenge for 24% of teachers just kind of raises some questions for me. So the next section on page 15 is talking about how engaged students are, or how interested they are to learn computer science. Now, what's interesting, if we look at like geography from urban to rural, it's like a 1% difference. If we look at race and ethnicity, it's only about a 3% difference. In income, it's about a 5% difference compared to schools with low income and high income. However, when we look at the grade levels between elementary, middle, and high school, there's an interesting spread that makes sense to me. So teachers reporting a lack of student CS interest. In elementary school, only 11% reported that. In middle school, 19% reported that. And in high school, 27% reported that. Now, one reason why that might make sense, in my opinion, is that in elementary school, it's usually required. You don't really get to have many electives in class. Maybe band, choir, orchestra as a pull-out elective, but that might be it. Otherwise, you're forced to go to art class. You're forced to go to PE class. You're forced to go to music class. You're forced to go to computer science class. That's typically how it works in most elementary schools that I'm aware of. It's not until middle school and high school when you're really able to start electing to take electives. So maybe it's just that students are interested in other areas more than computer science, and because of scheduling, they choose those subject areas over CS. But I don't know. Now, another interesting finding on the following page is on page 16. So it says, quote, only 61% of teachers across school profiles believe topics on inequity should be covered in their computer science class. A greater number of teachers were reticent to discuss topics of inequity in elementary schools, higher income schools, rural areas, and schools with a small proportion of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islander students, end quote. Why is that? Now, interestingly, the responses include some deficit language in terms of assumptions around students and families being incapable of doing things or not supporting things. And the quotes at the bottom of page 16 in particular are problematic from some of the responses. So I do recommend looking at that and then reflecting on it, because we as a field really kind of need to talk about these things. Like, for instance, as I've talked about before, there's a lot of documentaries and articles, publications around the bias that is found in face recognition technology. So there's a lot of false positives for people with darker complexion than there are for people with lighter complexion. That's something that we can and should talk about in relation to user design, human computer interaction, etc., and just general ethics in computing. So the fact that 39% of people didn't think we needed to talk about inequities in computer science, I respectfully disagree. But I don't know exactly why they're saying that. Maybe they're unaware of some of these designs that are essentially racist, intentionally or unintentionally. So one thing that I think we could all do is just not assume people are on the same wavelength with us when it comes to discussing inequities in computer science classes and making it a focal point. All right, so the third section starts on page 17, and so it addresses the question, to what extent are effective culturally relevant CS teaching practices currently reflected in pre-K-12 CS classrooms, and what are the challenges faced by teachers? So the first main section is talking about perceptions of existing curricula. So 65% of teachers believe that they had some curricular resources that met the diverse needs of their students, but 55% of teachers found themselves actually having to revise content to make it more engaging and or relevant to the kids that they were working with. So for example, making it more aligned to students' interests, or changing it up so that you had different levels of difficulty. So like, pick one of these three variations on the same idea. One is an intro version, one is an intermediate version, and one is a more advanced version. that all dives into the same concept. So if you are a curriculum provider, one thing that you could do is rate those kinds of differentiation in your materials, or make it so that your materials are more open source or easy to be modified. So for example, with the curriculum that I create at BootUp, we have them available on Google Docs, so you can save your own copy and then remove stuff that you don't need, or modify things to, like for example, align with your state standards as opposed to CSTA's national standards, etc. Now, on the next page, there's a really interesting paragraph that I'm going to read. So this is page 18. And it has to do with confidence in culturally relevant pedagogical practices. So here's the quote. Quote, "Despite making up the majority of the computer science teacher workforce, only 59% of white teachers, compared to 67% of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islander teachers, were confident utilizing materials highlighting race, ethnicity, and culture. In qualitative responses, one teacher shared, 'As a white person, I struggle with connecting CS to diverse cultures. I allow for personalization and encourage kids with the UBU mentality, but I still struggle with knowing how they may learn or connect differently.' Another shared, 'I don't know what underrepresented kids might see as more relevant. I also struggle with getting them to be motivated about computer science, so I would add some things that might motivate them more. I just don't know what that is yet.' As summarized by another teacher, 'There is a lack of teachers who are prepared to teach students of colors both academically and non-academically. Teachers' lack of confidence in this area negatively impact utilizing material highlighting diversity, which is disservice to students' academic progress. Not only will students have a narrower perception of who belongs in the field of computing, but it will also inhibit their ability to critically analyze bias in technology." End quote. All right, so that's a really important quote to really sit with as a field and really think through. Okay, so page 19 and on are basically the recommendations that teachers can do based on the findings. So I'm going to briefly summarize them, but again, I highly recommend you actually read this report. It's relatively short, only 23 pages, with lots of graphs and whatnot. But hopefully this gives you enough of a teaser to actually want to go out and check it out. So the first recommendation that they give is to develop incentive structures to recruit, retain, and diversify the pool of CS teachers. Which totally makes sense. I mean, we want to have CS educators who actually represent the diversity that we see in the communities impacted by computer science, which would be everybody. So we don't want to just have more white and Asian males in computer science. But honestly, these percentages were better than I thought they would be. I thought there would be a higher percentage of white individuals and a higher percentage of males within computer science education. So even though I was pleasantly surprised with that, there's obviously still some improvement that needs to be done in those areas and in other demographic areas besides just race, gender, and whatnot. All right, so the second recommendation that they provide is to build comprehensive teacher training, certification, and endorsement programs aligned to an equity-focused computing education framework. So this is kind of a twofer. So it's basically saying we recommend that you provide professional development and certification processes to help these teachers who don't feel confident yet in computer science, which I totally agree with. But they also recommend combining that with a focus on equity-centered computing education, which will hopefully address the issue of 39% of people thinking they don't need to talk about inequalities in computer science education, because we do. The third recommendation that they provide is to expand access to ongoing teacher professional development. So while point 2 is basically saying, hey, for pre-service educators, and even some educators that are currently in service, like higher education, we need to provide some support. But also we need to provide some ongoing professional development that helps out. You can't do these one and done, cool, I took a boot camp and now I know everything about computer science education and I never need to learn anything else. Instead, you gotta just continue in some kind of a sustainable fashion over the course of many years. So for example, when we are doing professional development at BootUp, we usually do a 2 to 3 year implementation with a district where we do a gradual release over to an instructional coach who will continue providing professional development to the teachers after our 2 or 3 year commitment is up. So the goal is to make it so that districts are sustainable so they can continue to train new teachers and continue to dive deeper into CS indefinitely. All right, so recommendation number 4 is to prioritize CS as a core course across the pre-K-12 pipeline. So what they're basically arguing is that rather than making it this optional thing, if it's part of the core, then it's more likely to happen within the school day, which I agree with, that is more likely to happen. But I disagree with core subjects and required courses in general, but I've talked about that in other podcast episodes, so I won't ramble on here. Instead, I will provide you the final recommendation that they give, which is to build a district-wide coalition to champion an equitable CS implementation plan. So in other words, finding some way to implement in a sustainable and equitable way. And as I mentioned, the approach that we use at BootUp really focuses on this, trying to make things sustainable and make it district-wide rather than just like only the gifted or honor students or only an after-school class or only one magnet school within a district. No, what we want is all schools and all grade levels at the elementary level to be engaging in computer science. And we found that to be extremely effective, especially because if you only have like one teacher or one class that's doing this, what if that teacher leaves your district? There goes your entire CS program. And you don't want that. Well, maybe you do. I can't speak for you. All right, so that basically concludes the main summary of some of the findings in this paper. Again, there's a lot more that I left out because I could have highlighted pretty much all of it and just read it verbatim, but I'd prefer to just point you towards the actual report so you can check it out. I do like to end these Unpacking Scholarship episodes talking about lingering questions that I have. In these questions, I'm actually just going to pose it, but I'm not going to talk about it because it's questions more for you to think about. So the first question that I have is, how does this report inform your own practices in CS education? And then the second question that I have is, what questions could they ask in the next iteration of this kind of survey? And I ask that because there's always room for improvement in survey research. So for example, I mentioned they don't include non-binary individuals in their data report or summary, and I think they should. So I think they should ask questions about that. And if you do have questions that you've got that you would like to share with them, reach out to the Kapor Center. I'm sure they're very willing to listen to some ideas and some questions that you might have. And I'll include a link to their website in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed listening to this summary of the report. I hope you consider reading it. Stay tuned next week for another interview, and stay tuned following week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode. Hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.